Welcome to Tisky Sour. Tonight's show is in two parts. For the first half, we are talking about Extinction Rebellion with that organisation's Clare Farrell public service announcement. We had announced it would be Roger Hallam, but Extinction Rebellion changed their representative for the show. So absolutely fabulous to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
And talking about Extinction Rebellion, we've also got Clare Hymer, who is the editor at Novara Media. In the second half of the show, we've got Jacobin and Guardian journalist Dawn Foster and Novara's very own James Butler talking about Brexit and the countdown to May's deal. But first things first. Extinction Rebellion launched on the 31st of October with a mobilisation of over 1,000 people in Parliament. Since then, they've sprayed government buildings, blocked main roads and bridges, and on Saturday, they dug multiple graves in Parliament Square and led a funeral procession to Buckingham Palace. This has all got a lot of media attention, primarily because of the willingness of activists to get arrested. Almost 100 have been arrested in the last 3 weeks. So, Clare Farrell, these are your tactics. What are your demands?
It's over 100 people have been arrested.
Over 100 people. How many? What's the exact figure?
I think it's over 130, but I'm not
wow.
sure. There's another 14 on Saturday. The demands that we've got are that the government should declare a climate emergency, that people should be told the truth about the dire situation that we're in the context of climate change and ecological collapse, that we should go zero carbon by 2025, which is an ambitious target, which lots of people have been very critical of, and also that we should form a citizens' assembly as a means to address the crisis and decide how to move forward.
Great. And where did the movement come from? Can you give me a little bit of background? I mean, to many people, it seems like it's come out of nowhere and suddenly making this huge impact.
Yeah, well, so it's been born out of a group of sort of decentralised activists called Rising Up. They've been together for longer than I've known them. So I'd say the work has been in process for longer than I've been involved, which is over 2 years. I've been involved for about a year and a half. The people that have kind of set this in motion up from the outset are people who've done a lot of research into social movements and how to achieve scaled change. And some of those people have been doing doctorate research. Some of those people have been long-term activists. There's a broad network of people who come from all different backgrounds, and they've been sort of putting their heads together for quite a long time to try and work out what to do in the face of obvious kind of systemic problems which are putting us at risk.
And how did you advertise it? Because you got 1,000 people to the first one when I hadn't heard of you. So I mean, how are you networking this movement?
Well, it's been a community organising kind of method, really. So lots of people going into their local communities or travelling to other communities around the country and doing talks. So there's a talk called Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It, which was initially written by one person and then rewritten by another person, and then it's been rewritten by another person. So there are many versions of that, and lots of people sort of give their own voice to it. There's lots and lots of people who've been giving it around the country. So I think it did hit its target of 100 meetings, lectures given throughout the course of the year since the sort of inception of the idea in spring. So
I really like the contrast in that title, actually. We're facing extinction, like really, it's like negative, fatalistic, and what to do about it. Arrests. Okay, so I think one of the things that's separated or distinguished your organisation from other climate movements that have gone before, they've often involved arrests. So after blocking, say, airports or coal power plants, people have been arrested, and that's been, let's say, factored in when the action was started. But you seem to have gone one step further and said, we're actively looking to get as many people arrested as possible. Is that the case, and what's the thinking behind that?
Well, I think it's an important factor to recognise, and we've been highly criticised for it. There's research to suggest that the effective social movements of the past that have really affected radical change, that's impacted on entire nations, have always involved huge numbers of arrests. There aren't any that don't involve that. So as a sort of empiricist, there's definitely somebody internally who's gone after that and said, this just has to happen. I think it's also crucial for people to show the willingness to forego their liberty when systems are so kind of when systems are so failing you so badly as a citizen, when your state is failing to protect your future, when you believe that your children might witness, the collapse of society and the breakdown of the support systems that we need, then if everybody seems to be sort of going along with it, then some people, I think, would argue that the only sort of moral position to take would be to say, I should be in prison because I don't want to be part of this society. I totally disagree. And as an individual person, what can you do to kind of reject all of the things that are going on around you? There's a sort of long history of that. So I think there's a sort of deepness to the idea of giving up your freedom, and also the sympathy that draws with people when they sort of understand that you're taking it that seriously. So,
and have you been surprised
kind of
at how many
part of
people have been willing to get arrested over the last 3 weeks? It's quite a lot. I'm surprised.
I am impressed with the numbers in one sense, because I did think that you may see a big drop. Obviously, at the end of a talk that says we're heading for extinction, what would you be willing to do about it? There's 3 boxes you can tick. Would you help? Would you get arrested? Would you be willing to go to prison? So that was what was laid on the table for people to see what their sort of interest was. And when you go to certain communities, like you might have 40% of the room say, I would be willing to be arrested for a movement which might work. And let's just be frank, this is not something that we know is going to work. Okay, so we're not claiming that we've got the total solution here and that we're completely right. But then you have this percentage of people as well who would say, well, actually, I would also do a prison sentence because I think this is that important, And when you get those figures back, you know that when you go out on the street, how many of them are going to actually show up and how many of them are actually going to be willing to sort of follow that through. And I am sort of quietly surprised by how many people came and did that.
And that leads me on nicely to the next question, which was, obviously none of us know how to achieve the goals we want. We're all, to some degree, stabbing in the dark. But I mean, what do you see as the plausible, as the possible avenue to achieving your goals via the action you're taking? How does Extinction Rebellion see the next month, the next year? What's the plan, basically?
Okay, well, there was always a kind of strategy in place for an escalation in autumn and then another one in the spring with kind of international solidarity. So there's lots of outreach going on. Somebody posted recently a Google Maps thing where you can click through and you can see groups popping up around the world. So that's interesting because I think that international outreach, which I haven't been a big part of at all, is going phenomenally well, because there's something of the urgency of this moment that I think a lot of people recognise, and that goes around the world. But for the meantime, I think what we all need to do is have a sort of breathe out and reflect. It's been an incredibly intense last few weeks. And we're very centred on debrief, reflection, and internally dealing with ourselves and dealing with each other and talking about how things work. And because I think some of us maybe were expecting something to really take off, but for me personally, this has gone non-linear, you might say. It's not what I expected, was for it to have this kind of amount of attention, or for us to be capable of doing what we did last Saturday and shutting down those many bridges at a time, all at the same time. And so there's a sort of, we all need a moment to take on board what's happened and talk about how we sort of keep momentum going forward. So I think in the interim, we're leading up to the 15th of April next year to something with international solidarity in terms of like further rebellion. But in the meantime, we all have to work out what keeping momentum and not doing it for momentum's sake looks like, and that's something that we all, I think, need a moment to sort of think about. And I've just left a huge debrief session today, so I mean we're sort of working quite hard to try and process what's going on.
So on Novara Media, we've had both positive and negative output re-Extinction Rebellion. So if you want to learn more in terms of what we've done already, there's an interview with George Monbiot with James Butler on our podcast, who obviously is a huge advocate of the Extinction Rebellion movement. We also had a critical article by Chris Saltmarsh, which you can check out on our website. Clare Hymer, sorry, I have to do surnames because you both got the same first name. Clare Hymer, you've fallen more into the critical camp.
Yes,
so
I would say so.
Where are you coming from as someone witnessing Extinction Rebellion?
Yeah.
And also someone who's been part of the climate movement for a while, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. As in, I'm definitely coming from a position of recognising, like you guys do, that we are facing a massive, massive crisis. And I think it's precisely for that reason that I am quite critical of Extinction Rebellion, because, you know, the stakes are so high here, and I feel like, you know, we've got to get it right. To pick up first on the issue of kind of mass arrests, because that's what's got the most media attention, it seems to me very much like arrests are useful when they make the state look unreasonable, right? When it looks like the people getting arrested have like unassailable moral rights on their side, and, you know, the state is behaving in a way which is really unreasonable when recognising that. You know, I think a really good example of this is in the fracking cases that have happened recently. So, you know, people were putting their bodies in the way of construction vehicles getting to fracking sites because, you know, it was very much a last resort. They weren't, you know, out seeking to get arrested, but they kind of got to the point where they were like, this is the last thing that we can do. And, you know, I think the police violence in response to that, you know, it looks very unreasonable. And I think it, you know, goes some way to, getting the public on board in terms of recognising the importance of climate change and how critical it is that we stop it. I guess the reason why then tactics in terms of Extinction Rebellion don't quite add up is that, there was, you know, a video with Roger Hallam on The Guardian, him saying, we want to get a load of people arrested. The arrests aren't happening quick enough. And it kind of seems to me that, you know, it doesn't make the state look unreasonable if you're kind of begging for it. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I think to draw the comparison between us and the fracking movement is an interesting one, because the approach is extremely different from my perspective. And we had some people who came down from PNR for the beginning of the rebellion. We did we celebrated Preston New Road at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial
PNR?
Strategy.
Sorry,
Preston New Road.
Okay.
Where the fracking site in the northwest.
Okay.
So we had some people came down from there for the opening of the sort of week of rebellion. We made some nice artwork to replicate their artwork from the northwest to sort of put outside the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy to say to Clare Perry, who's never been to Preston New Road or any fracking sites, to meet the protesters, here's PNR, we've kind of brought it to you. And there's just, for me, a very big difference between putting bodies on the line as part of a resistance movement, which is what that is, and then putting your body in a space in a proactive sense where you're facing the state, because it's not completely the same kind of strategy as far as I can see. So that's one difference that I think is important to recognise. And as I say, this is experimental. You know, we don't know how this is going to turn out, and we don't know if it's going to work. We can only kind of work on the data that we've got and the ideas that we've culminated over the last few years, kind of collectively. But I think that it's just so important for people to kind of recognise that if you think about the severity of the situation, if you think that like people in this country are likely to be facing a massive food crisis in the next 10 years, then even if we don't achieve our aims, which I've just explained to you, the sort of the demands, I think that Extinction Rebellion is an alarm. You know, it's and getting this kind of media attention is not very easy. And I do think that we've had this kind of concept, which has been in the talks, which has gone around the country, about shifting the Overton window around like the level of the threat that we face. This isn't like, oh, this is a really bad crisis and we should be taking it more seriously. It's like, this is an existential threat. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's why this approach seems to me to be sort of relatively appropriate. And in terms of sort of self-sacrifice, you know, I've also, with many other people in our movement, undergone a mass hunger strike, you know, and I think that's another thing which is important to recognise as a level of kind of self-sacrifice that says, you know, this is what I'm willing to give up for this movement. And a lot of people that we've talked about in the research of like social movements, you know, they would die for their movement. You don't hear any environmentalists say that they would die for the movement, not certainly from like the sort of, from the UK or from America or whatever. So yeah, I think it's like taking a different approach, really, facing the state rather than putting yourself in the way of a specific site.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let me pick you up then on. So you mentioned that it's an existential crisis that's facing us. I think another problem that I have with Extinction Rebellion is precisely this kind of framing. So, even the title, Extinction Rebellion, the word extinction is kind of getting at the fact that the Earth is facing, what's being called a sixth mass extinction. But it's also kind of hinting at the idea that, humans as a species could become extinct. It's definitely my feeling, and I think a feeling of a lot of other people in the climate movement, that this actually isn't the case, and that basically the very, very rich will quite literally weather the storm. I think a really good example of this is I don't know if you saw, but during the kind of California wildfires that are happening very recently, it was reported that Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, they literally employed private firefighters in order to defend their homes and those of their friends and family, which I think is a really good example of how when facing this crisis, climate change, it affects people very, very differently, dependent on, race, dependent on class, depending on, whether or not you live in the global south. And this idea of extinction, I think, kind of like masks those differences in a way which I think is maybe quite damaging. And for me, I don't think that Extinction Rebellion, or at least the kind of press attention that it's getting, and that there's being enough done to kind of centre that reality.
Yeah, I think that there's always been two things that are present for us when we talk about what we're facing. One is climate change. Some people within our group have been very focused on, looking at physical laws and then saying, if you lose all of the ice, then you gain heat because the dark water absorbs it and the white ice should be reflecting it. And so you can add up these kind of like projected figures and say, if we follow this path, then the world is already this far above the pre-industrial average, then it will go more, then we'll gain this through this feedback loop, and then we'll gain this through this. And you can see there that we end up on a catastrophic course. It's very important to us that that message around climate also comes with the message around the extinction crisis, because arguably if you could suck all the carbon out of the sky and you could fix climate change in some kind of like really rapid way, the world would still be losing life at a rate which is completely incompatible with our sort of organised life. And the temperature that we're already at is, with the carbon lag and what's locked in, we understand, and we talk about this a lot, that people all over the world are going to be affected by this in different ways. And if it goes beyond a certain point, which arguably lots of people have fought for through the Paris talks and stuff like that, the fight for people in the global south is we know it's so much more real. We know that the effects are already there. We know that we're likely to watch Bangladesh go underwater before people in the sort of westernized societies really sort of have to suffer too greatly on the consequences. But the real crux of what we've been trying to push forward in the conversation is that, everybody in the world is going to face a lack of food. Everybody in the world is going to suffer because crops are declining and declining. And that just seemed to us, not from any kind of like big moral stance, we think it's the most important thing to talk about food security, but it is really important. And if you're trying to have a sort of universality of messaging, which is what we've kind of tried to achieve, so we're not politically affiliated, we don't want to sort of appear to be leaning towards the left or the right. If you want to really sort of present something to people that everybody can get behind, then I think everybody can get behind feeding their children. And if there's a mass food crisis, then the rich may be able to get firefighters in and protect their property to an extent, but then are they just going to live in like a barren wasteland until their food runs out? It's kind of, I think it's, for me, it seems quite likely that the rich won't just weather this storm. I don't think so. Not if it goes into the catastrophic place where I think it potentially could, I mean,
I think it's precisely this kind of universality of messaging, which I understand in terms of like the point of view of trying to kind of get lots of people on board and engage in the campaign. But I think it is this moral appeal rather than a political appeal that I have a real problem with. I, don't really see in the Extinction Rebellion movement a really clear understanding that this is a crisis. This is a political crisis of capitalism and of colonialism, and the only this isn't a crisis also that's going to be solved by kind of making demands of a state which is fundamentally kind of part of this. Our government, it's not some kind of father figure that can just who's been led astray and is no longer kind of like protecting us, as I think some of the messaging around Extinction Rebellion has been saying. Our government, it subsidises fossil fuels. It's deliberately, it wants the fossil fuel industry to prosper because it benefits Western companies and Western states, right? So I don't know. Just for me, there's a real lack of this kind of like political analysis, which I think is what's actually needed in order to understand the crisis as it exists, and therefore think through ways to tackle it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of our demands, which is for me the most important one, is that there should be a People's Assembly that is formed that's able to look at this crisis and decide how we move out of it. It's really important to me that this isn't a campaign that just has a demand which can be potentially agreed to and then skewed and turned into something else, which we all know the political arena is perfectly good at. The proposal is for this to be a process. So there's a process which is what we want to put in place, which is a form of direct democratic process, which I think is something which would not just hand over power to the state. We're not saying, dear state, please save us, but we're recognising that we're not going to have a revolution and tear everybody out of Westminster and start from scratch again. It's got to be something that acts really, really quickly. And I think that there's enough kind of evidence about sortition-based people's assemblies that could be a really, really helpful way to kind of get people to politically be able to look at this situation. And we're not trying to offer solutions because the solutions are so sort of varied and the problem is extremely complex, and we don't want to put ourselves forward and say, we're here, we know what we're talking about, here's the answer. But we do think that there's a need to sort of shake the public consciousness, and I feel that that's what we're kind of already starting to hopefully manage to do. And it's not to be divided around politics. I've been talking a lot to people who are very passionate about all kinds of different issues, and we've worked hard to try and have an angle that can speak to people who are right-leaning and people who are centrist and people who are left-leaning, to say, this is I believe, obviously the solutions will turn out to be highly politicised, but as far as recognising the crisis goes, it's not a political problem, it's an existential threat, and that means that it includes everybody. It even includes Kim Kardashian, do you know what I mean? And then they should all be very afraid of the future, because there's nobody making decisions to mitigate for that future being extremely dangerous. So that's kind of where we're coming from.
I'm going to start bringing in some questions. I mean, you keep asking questions as well, but Tanisara Mary Weinberg says, so what is Clare Hymer's strategy? And Nikki M says, it's all very well criticising Extinction Rebellion, but what's the alternative? Everything else has been tried and has failed.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot today, and I kind of actually disagree with the suggestion that everything has been tried and failed. I think, fundamentally for me, a key problem with Extinction Rebellion is that they're not actually targeting the businesses which are, perpetuating the crisis, right? So one thing that hasn't been tried on a mass scale, I think, is targeting the banks. So, fossil fuel companies, they're very, very wealthy, but they don't have kind of like the liquid cash that's necessary in order to build their own infrastructure. They need banks to finance that. And so I really think that, a very targeted campaign at banks to defund the fossil fuel industry, with kind of like the mass support that Extinction Rebellion has been getting, could be a real avenue for success. It's been tried and tested a little bit already by organisations like People and Planet, like 350, and with kind of a very limited amount of pressure, there have already been wins there. So for me personally, that would be a much more strategic angle. I also think we do need to talk about the role of policy making and the Labour Party in this. So it kind of seems very much to me like, with the time we've got, which, according to various reports is, maybe about 12 years, there's no time to kind of like build brand new political institutions through which to address this crisis. And, Labour's, I don't think you could ever say that it's ever been the party of the environment. It's, never been particularly exciting in terms of environmental policy. But I do think that the, what we've seen recently does show real promise for how we could, really push for policies. So, through democratising policy making as well as other parts of the party in order to really make people's demands on climate change heard. I don't think it would be easy, but to me it feels a hell of a lot more realistic than what Extinction Rebellion's proposing.
Okay, so I'd just speak to the banking thing. There are people in Rising Up who've conducted targeted campaigns against Barclays for their investment in fracking. So that is something that we've already been a part of. I mean, in terms of speaking about the Labour Party, I think what we're trying to put forward here is that a kind of recognition of virtue ethics and thinking about when you face something that's very severe and very urgent, what does it mean to live a good life? Now, when I went on hunger strike, I sat outside the Labour Party headquarters and told them that I was not going to eat anything until they agreed to draw a 3-line whip against the expansion of an airport runway at Heathrow, and that was because we wanted to put across to them the morality of this situation. Like it's not acceptable for a progressive leftist party, I don't think, now in the current context, the situation that we're in, to not sort of say to all of its members, like, we have to be categorically against climate change, and it's very high risk, and nobody's paying any attention to the precautionary principle, and for that reason we should take a very, very strong moral stance on it. I don't think that it's appropriate to sort of tweak at the sides of politics and talk about like writing policy which may or may not work or may not get like Labour Party members to vote for it. I mean, we got voted heavily down in the Labour Party in that vote. We lost that massively, and they said strategically to us there was nothing better that they could do. Drawing a 3-line whip on that wasn't a good idea for them, and so they weren't going to do it, and it wouldn't work anyway. But like, why isn't the Labour Party like better on green issues? Like, it's sort of historically, I think the left is about, Labour and capital, and I understand that all of that, and I would be a left-leaning person myself if we were talking about politics, but this just isn't, for me, an appropriate place to sort of talk about the nuances of political position. And I think that that's why our voice has been criticised so much for being so sort of like universal messaging heavy, because it's just trying to get people to understand that this needs for everybody to sort of look down, like deep inside themselves, and think about like what the future looks like and what they might do to change that. And I don't think that I have all the solutions, and I don't think that the Labour Party has the solutions, and I don't think the trade unions are going to save us. I don't think that anything that exists right now is going to save us, and that's the kind of deep grief for the sort of unfathomably kind of tragic situation that we're in, is like what we're asking people to sort of go into grief and like move into action, and then let's see kind of where that goes. And I think there's like hopefully room for all of this stuff to kind of merge together eventually, and for people to have like constructive conversations and work out like where the left is and where the right is and what it all means politically. But I think for now this isn't really for me about talking about sort of Labour policy. I don't think that's an appropriate conversation to sort of have straight away, because we're still in the phases of sort of helping the public to sort of go, oh right, we've got no time left, and that's not okay, and what do we think about that? Do you know what I mean? Like there's a sort of overstepping of people from kind of thinking that they're in a state of abject denial to this kind of like doomism, and everyone's saying, oh, we're totally fucked. But actually there's been no space in the middle, I don't think, for anybody to kind of like take on board the magnitude of what we're facing and how much we've destroyed already and what dangerous position we're in. So for me, that's kind of that's just where I am, and also, by the way, I'm only one person as part of a very big decentralised movement.
I've got a question from Darla Gabriel, who's one of ours. She's a Novara editor watching. What relationship do you have with frontline communities in the Global South and Indigenous communities facing the brunt of the crisis? How are you acting in solidarity with them?
So we've been networking, that's not my area, but I know that we've been networking with various groups, and we've been developing some quite nice connections with some African communities, and certainly one group with Stop the Manganese. I think it's been a challenge for people to kind of make those connections, and as we're sort of only just launching, it's not something that we feel is as strong as it needs to be. And we've tried to bring like the witnesses from the Global South to the bridges on that Saturday when we blocked them, and bring them to the fore and ask them to speak to us, and ask them for what they need really to sort of be empowered to become sort of part of the movement or to join in or whatever, you know. And I think those conversations, those relationships need to be built quite carefully. You could ask somebody else who would know much more about that aspect of it, because I'm...
Can I just add, do you not think it's precisely the problem of saying, you know, we need Global South, witnesses to join in, and not for those people to be leading the movement? Do you not think that that's precisely, a problem in terms of how we organise in the Global North? You know, we're not the people who are being affected now. They are. So surely we should be the ones kind of like following their lead and, you know, acting in solidarity with them, rather than having them as some kind of like, in a joining in type way, if that makes sense.
Well, I think the thing is that what we're doing is facing our own government and our own state and our own situation in the UK, and we understand that as kind of doing what we can affect them with the most sort of with the most possibility. And what we're talking to other groups about that want to form in other countries is like how we've organised here and what we've reflected on and what data we've got. And if they want to talk about that stuff, then we can talk about it. And people are organising themselves in their own communities and in their own countries. So it's not for us to say, you know, we've just brought these people to give them a voice when we blocked a bridge, to say we think it's important that we have voices from the Global South here to speak about what's going on for them and for their communities and for their people. But, you know, what we're doing here, because we're decentralised, what we're doing here isn't like global domination. We're not trying to say that we're going to like manage other people's campaigns in other countries. It's like we're just trying to spark something here, which hopefully, if it's useful, can be replicated in other places, and people can do that in a way which is for them and which suits them, if you know what I mean.
I've got a question for you, Clare Hymer, which was a widespread response to Chris Saltmarsh's article and is implicit in some of the questions that are on YouTube now, which is, I mean, it's all very well pointing out the limitations of any movement. So people could also do that about Momentum, they could do that about Labour. Every movement has its limitations. But what's the value of critiquing a movement because of its limitations instead of celebrating the fact that something's going on? You know, at least something's happening. So I suppose a way of phrasing that is, do you think there's anything actively bad about what's going on with Extinction Rebellion to the extent that you feel the need to oppose it, as opposed to give friendly suggestions about where you think it might be lacking, which all movements essentially necessarily are?
I mean, I guess I'd start by saying that I feel that, actually a lot of the criticism that Extinction Rebellion has been getting, it kind of comes with this recognition that, you know, it's great that there's so many people are being mobilised, and, you know, I totally, you know, commend that. I think it's really, really inspiring and incredible. I guess the thing that for me means that it warrants criticism the most is that it doesn't feel drastically different from a lot of kind of climate activism that's gone before. As in, even, you know, I came down to the demonstration on Saturday, and, you know, I actually found it quite dispiriting how many faces I recognised from, you know, COP21 in Paris, from people who live in a kind of eco-community that my parents live in back in Lancaster. And I found that worrying, you know, also looking in terms of, looking at Extinction Rebellion in terms of its strategy, because it seems like that also is really not particularly new, that I think it is important actually to criticise it, because, you know, as you so rightly point out, we've got so little time in order to find a solution to this crisis. And if Extinction Rebellion isn't offering us anything new, then we do need to criticise that in order to find a way forward.
We're going to do final points, and then we're moving on to Brexit in the second half. So I suppose, yeah, sum up your responses to to that or to anything?
Well, firstly, I really welcome all the criticism that we've had. I think it's really important because it shows that people think that what we're doing might just matter a little bit, and that's really appreciated. And I think even all of the articles that have come through in great criticism have been extremely helpful, and we're like very open to taking criticism. And we've just spent the last couple of weeks deeply criticising ourselves and not actually celebrating any of what we've done at all, I feel, in some respects. So it's important that people know that that gets heard, it gets discussed, we take it all very seriously, it's important to us. In terms of the same old faces, I mean, you know, there are a limited number of activists in this country that are presently sort of active. So if those people come, then you're going to see them all. But there's also beautiful sort of recognition of sort of elders and videos of people that I saw the other day coming from the bridges, which, you know, we had 6,000 people on those bridges, and they weren't all people that sort of do hardline campaigning or that have been sort of involved in direct action before and stuff like that. So I think in terms of like mobilising people around the concept of mass participation in disobedient actions, I do think that there's been some success in mobilising new people, and of course some of the old faces are there as well. But yeah, I mean, I think so far it's been a very interesting few weeks, and hopefully we can continue to grow and find all of the other people who feel that they've never kind of necessarily had a place to go. And just I would say on one thing about the talk and the way that we've like got people involved, I have met quite a few people through the course of like doing outreach and speaking to people about this topic that, you know, when they witness people sort of talking about the graveness of the threat that we face, some people do come to you and say, I'm so glad that you've just said that, because usually my friends are all saying that I'm mental because I think that like the world's going to collapse and I don't have a space in which I can be honestly as concerned as I am about that. So it's, you know, it's trying to open up quite an emotional place, and it's important that people recognise that.
Clare Hymer.
I guess my final point would just be that I do think that there is a lot to commend in terms of how Extinction Rebellion has mobilised people really quickly. But just to say that I feel, as it stands, it may be good for kind of raising attention of the issue of the climate crisis, but in terms of a strategy of kind of blocking roads and therefore somehow managing to get the government to kind of like cede to your demands, I don't think that's practical. But I do think that a lot can be done with that energy if it is directed in a more strategic way. Yes.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both so much for coming on.
Thank you, Michael.
I'm sure we'll definitely be speaking to you more soon, Clare, because you're a Novara crew, and I'm looking forward to looking at the development of Extinction Rebellion. Next up, as you know, we have Dawn Foster and James Butler talking about the shit show that is May's efforts to get her Brexit deal passed. To lead us in, we're going to segue from one movement that aims to get arrested to one that, according to many leftists on Twitter, probably should do. This is Ofok playing with fire in Brussels.
Okay. Yeah. Plastic flag near the sofa.
Okay, we're back. Sorry, I was just trying to locate a beer in the little break, but it didn't happen. And before the Red Raw make another video, I don't actually think Ofok should be arrested, but I do think those actions did look a little bit silly, but we've all done silly things. So what can you say? Dawn Foster,
Hey.
how's it going?
Not bad. Just covered myself in Guinness.
Ooh, it does get a bit hot in here.
Yeah.
Call you off as we talk. James Butler, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well.
We're talking, as everyone has to talk about, if they do political TV, Brexit, the passing or not passing of May's Brexit deal. We're not going to go into the details of what's in it because we've done that already. So we're looking at what has developed, what has happened in the last week. The news today is that the vote on this deal will be on Tuesday, the 11th of December. Did I get that right? We were arguing earlier about what day it was.
You were wrong.
Until then, we will have 2 weeks of intense government whipping. Alex Wickham, once of Guido, now of BuzzFeed, wrote an inside story of the botched operation to get the deal passed. Dawn Foster, you've been reading from this and think it has some interesting insights for us about what's currently going on within the Tory government.
It's a lot of fun. So Theresa May has apparently assembled a crack team called, very, very imaginatively, Project Vote. and and the team are sat in number 10, and the plan is that they will try and push through the vote, and they expect to lose it. But Theresa May apparently says that if she loses by under 100 votes, then she thinks she's still in the game. And so she's assembled a number of people to try and push this through afterwards. And it just seems like a kind of lost cause at this point. I mean,
that's quite low standards, isn't it? It's kind of standards where Liz Kendall would feel very proud of her 2015 leadership election.
Pretty much. I mean, like you go to a bar and you hit on 100 people and nobody says anything and you think, oh, I'm still in the game.
The big news over the weekend, well, there's a bunch of it, but one of them was Labour backbenchers who we at one point thought might help May over the line have come out and said they could not support the deal as it currently stands. Lisa Nandy was one of them. She confirmed to Sophia Ridge on Sunday that she couldn't support May's deal. James, Momentum launched a big campaign to pressure Labour MPs to vote down the deal. Is that battle won? Can we all relax as Labour Party members wanting our representatives to bring down the government?
Yeah, I don't think we can quite relax yet. So Gavin Barwell, who lost his seat at the last election, is now one of Theresa May's myrmidons in number 10. He's summoned Labour MPs to a briefing on the deal tonight. It started just at the same time that this show started at 8 p.m. And I'm sure the contents of that briefing will be leaked by tomorrow morning. But this is essentially an attempt, probably, to get Labour MPs, if they don't vote for the bill the first time, to feel comfortable voting for it the second time. So this is the situation that we're in now. It seems to me very, very unlikely, and as Dawn was suggesting, very, very unlikely that the bill will pass unamended, because this is another thing that Theresa May has done. She's announced that she's going to ignore the recommendations of the Procedures Committee, and she will essentially put the bill to Parliament and say you can either say yes or no. And there are reasons for that, most of them boring, probably not worth going into. I do it so you don't have to. But so she knows.
We need to start promoting our Brexit sections better, don't we? So we're going to talk about Brexit now because we feel like we probably should do.
Yeah. But also, I mean, one thing I think was very interesting was that Theresa May's Project Vote had said that they expected that they would go back to Brussels. So she keeps saying in the House, and she spent hours today stood in front of MPs, and I think somebody pointed out it was 35 MPs interjected before somebody was positive about the deal.
Don't pity her.
You were finishing a point, weren't you, James? What were you saying?
I was just going to say, so there are two things. One is that Labour MPs, many of whom have suggested previously that they might vote for it if it were good, are now saying, oh, I can't vote for this bill. But that doesn't mean that they're going to vote against it. So obviously MPs have the option to abstain on a vote. And now it could well be that the vote, doesn't go her way the first time, it's actually voted down. She goes and does a little jig with people in Brussels, gets some cosmetic alterations, comes back. And meanwhile, Sterling has tanked. May comes back and holds a gun to the head of Parliament and says, this is the new deal, pretty much the same as the old deal. I've got one symbolic concession, maybe, whatever. Vote or don't vote, but it's your responsibility if the nation collapses. At that point, that's when I think you can see those MPs who've said, I won't vote for the bill, say, well, I still can't vote for the withdrawal agreement as it stands, but I'm not going to vote against it at that time. And those will be the people probably that are likely to carry it through. So that's my concern with the Labour Party and its MPs. And obviously, Labour MP is not known for possession of a spine, so I think it's good to keep the pressure on.
Dawn, do you think Labour have worked out why they're opposing the deal? I mean, from a strategic perspective, it's quite simple. They want to bring down the government and have a general election. But I think when they speak to the public, they need a different reason, right? Because that looks like they're just playing politics. So do you think they have successfully articulated why they are opposed to May's deal?
I think the first argument is a good one. I think that
Do you think the public will accept that?
I think that if Theresa May loses a vote and can't govern, and that she has a supply and demand deal with the DUP and they don't honour it, then I think that most of the public will accept that she can't govern. And, you know, YouGov have looked into it and the majority of people oppose what they understand of Theresa May's deal. So she clearly has no real understanding. She hasn't managed to get a good deal that people are really into. So I think that Labour saying she can't do it, we should have a crack at it, is a good enough reason, to be honest.
What are your problems with it? What don't you like about it?
My chief problem is basically its provisions around tying us to EU regulations on state aid. That's a major problem for me. And obviously there are, and this ties into a debate that's been going on for a long time about whether, a future Labour government would be able to enact its manifesto within the European Union. There are a variety of views on that. You have someone like Danny Nicol, who is professor or reader in international law, European law, I can't remember which. No, public law, my apologies, at the University of Westminster. And he says, no, it definitely can't. You have people like Andy Tarrant who say, actually it's possible. To me, it seems that, it will be somewhere between a giant headache and an enormous obstructive political nightmare. That seems clear to me. So the question is, where you go to and from on that. The other question is about migration, freedom of movement. So the thing that's very obvious to me, and the thing that has been obvious to me throughout, is that what Theresa May is in politics for is to stop migration. It is her, bête noire. She loves bashing immigrants. She did it as Home Secretary, and it's been a real plank of her public appearance as Prime Minister. And it's, in fact, how she's intending to sell the deal. If you look at the speeches she's been given, she doesn't talk about anything else other than saying, freedom of movement will end. That is how she is going to sell this deal. Now, I think it's pretty clear that the Labour Party can come out and say, we're not hamstrung by the ERG, we're not hamstrung by Shire racists, and we want, state aid. These are the three, key things the Labour Party can do to differentiate itself.
So they could be making a stronger argument about state aid, I suppose. I haven't heard that mentioned that much. Dawn, I want to take advantage of having you on the show.
Great.
Because I think you have an area of expert knowledge which not many people in the British media do, which is about the politics of Northern Ireland. Everyone is talking about the DUP, but it's often, I suppose without context, you don't actually know where they're coming from. So Arlene Foster has promised she will not vote against this deal. Double negative there. Promised she will vote against this deal, but doesn't seem to want to bring down the government. What's going on? What motivates Arlene Foster and the DUP in Westminster?
So, first of all, Arlene Foster isn't in Westminster. She's an MLA.
That was really exposing my ignorance, wasn't it?
She is the leader of the DUP, but she isn't in Westminster. And I think that's a really, really key point to make. So basically, Arlene Foster is the leader of the DUP, but she is hamstrung by the DUP MPs who are actually in Westminster. And those 10 MPs make up the supply and confidence deal that actually keep the numbers up for Theresa May. And I think Theresa May, from the outset, assumed that they would, as a small party, fall in line with whatever she wanted, which was an incredibly stupid thing to do if you had spent more than 5 minutes on any Wikipedia page about Northern Irish politics, which clearly they hadn't done. And
nor me, apparently.
No. And I mean, even today you had Sammy Wilson, who it's awful that people are treating seriously now, talking in Westminster about this. And the fact is that the DUP MPs know that they have a huge amount of power. They can easily bring down her government. There are already going to be Tory rebels, so she just doesn't have the mouth. Everybody knows that. And Arlene Foster, as the leader of the DUP, is playing very, very smart game in that she knows that she doesn't have to say exactly how they're going to vote until it happens. So in the finance bill the other day, one of the reasons why Labour didn't have all of their people in Parliament to win it was that the DUP didn't tell anybody how they were going to vote. They just, amongst themselves, they just voted against the finance bill. And the government were very, very shocked. Labour were shocked. Everybody was shocked. Arlene Foster and the DUP know they don't have to play their hand until the very end, which means that until the very end, they don't have to negotiate fully. So they have a lot of time to wait for Theresa May to offer them even more. It was pointed out that of the, I think, 1 billion that was promised them as part of the supply and confidence deal, only about 0.5, only 50% of it has so far been given to Northern Ireland. So there's still a lot at stake for them. So, at the moment, there isn't any real reason for the DUP to play their hands. But at the same time, the DUP are playing an extraordinarily dangerous game, which is the fact that a lot of their electorate, who are often farmers, they're often unionist businessmen, do actually like the deal because it provides because the backstop means that Northern Ireland are in a unique position in the EU where they have a massive competitive advantage.
Because they're both sort of in the single market and have complete free trade with the mainland.
Completely. So every businessman I spoke to, I got extraordinarily drunk with some Northern Irish businessmen in Dublin the other night, which you must never do. And every single one of them is over the moon about the backstop agreement. Everybody I speak to, so the chair of the CBI Northern Ireland is, very, very clear that this is what they want. But the DUP don't want it. And it seems to be basically the DUP have committed, the politicians have committed to the philosophical tenets of unionism, but their electorate have looked at the pragmatics and said, actually, the backstop is more important to us. The day-to-day reality of business in Northern Ireland is more important to us than having no regulatory divergence.
Yeah, that's a question I wanted to ask, actually. So the DUP, they have a very simple and easily understandable objection to the deal, which is that Northern Ireland gets a different deal from the rest of the UK, and that to them is unconscionable as a unionist. But you're saying that's not them representing the same passions as their electorate. You think that's specific to the parliamentarians of the DUP, not unionists generally in Northern Ireland?
Absolutely. So when I speak to a lot of the MLAs who are currently not sitting in Stormont, and I don't think Stormont will sit again, to be honest, when I speak to the MLAs spend a lot more time on the ground speaking to voters. The DUP MPs spend a lot more time in Westminster, and they're a lot more hard line in terms of DUP. The MPs will stick to the philosophy of unionism at all costs, whereas the rest of them realise that there is a big divergence between voting, and you may, there is a big worry as well. So on top of all of this Brexit stuff, there was a lot of there were a lot of kind of research studies coming out of universities, etc., that say that the demographics of Northern Ireland are changing to the fact, towards the fact that within a few years you may actually see like Sinn Féin taking over, whereas previously the unionists have had a kind of demographic kind of boost in terms of numbers.
Oh, so Catholic? Well, is it still a Catholic Protestant thing?
Say nationalist.
Okay,
don't do that.
Say nationalist.
Sorry, I'm gonna without
by
any shame display my ignorance.
By 2022, nationalists may outnumber unionists. I'm not going to get into anything else.
Okay.
And so there is that big worry. And at the moment, if you have unionists voters feeling they aren't represented by the DUP, and a lot of them are farmers, a lot of them have, businessmen and women in their constituencies, there is that big disconnect. And almost all of the business people I speak to, very few of them are actually nationalists, but a lot of them are unionists, and they're really angry at the DUP.
I mean, it's worth saying, of course, that although Arlene may theoretically sit in the Legislative Assembly, she certainly doesn't at the moment.
No.
I don't know whether our audience pay attention to politics in North of Ireland, but there isn't a Legislative Assembly at the moment, and it's her fault.
It is her fault. Peter Robinson called for them to go back today. Everybody I've spoken to in Northern Ireland says that they miss the days of Peter Robinson because he would actually come to the table. And actually, Arlene was ready to go back in January, and it was, from everybody I've heard from in terms of nationalists and unionists, it was the DUP MPs who said, don't go back to Stormont because it won't help us. We have all the power we need in Westminster.
Moving back to Westminster, Theresa May has suddenly converted to being an enthusiast of televised debates. She's challenged Jeremy Corbyn to a debate about the deal. This was after she famously refused to take part in an election debate in 2017. James, will it happen?
I very much doubt it will happen.
I want it to happen because we do an excellent sort of live reaction afterwards on Novara Media. But
I want it to happen. I think it'd be great. I assume Amber Rudd is preparing her notes to take her place already. But no, look, so what she
worth noting last time Amber Rudd had to go on in Theresa May's place, I think 2 days after her dad had died.
Yeah.
Look, the thing that I think is clear is that Theresa May's strategy was, we'll offer it to Corbyn, and because Corbyn is, some sort of ignoramus who has his strings pulled by, Seamus or whatever, he'll say no because he can't deal with a live debate situation. And this is an example of the Tories believing their own propaganda about the opposition instead of remembering that it's propaganda. Corbyn loves debates. He took part in the one in the 2017 election. A May Corbyn debate is perfect for him because he will be able to to draw out the issues on Brexit and connect it to exactly what she has been responsible for in this country for so long. Now, obviously, she knows that. So what she wanted was a kind of, I don't know if you remember when Blair used to do those kind of question time, town hall style, like, let me explain to you why killing Iraqis is good. That's what she wanted. And that's exactly what she's not going to get. However, they face these problems now. So they've suggested this will happen. Now they have to find a slot for it. So it would be a Sunday evening primetime television. The suggestion is it would be up against I'm a Celebrity. Well, I don't know television schedules, but I've been reading the articles.
I've been reading. It's called the TV Guide, James.
No, look, I'm not suggesting I don't watch television. I'm just saying I don't know the schedule. Anyway.
None of us make the schedules.
Anyway, so there's that. And then there are, obviously you have people from the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, everyone saying, we should be in it, we should be allowed to be part. And you indeed have even, I think, Gina Miller coming and saying people's vote should be part of it.
Why can't I be on it?
Yeah. But Gina Miller, who at the Liberal Democrat conference this year stood up and said, I don't want to be a politician.
No way.
Well, then don't. So this is going to be a problem. So it'll be a problem with scheduling, and it'll be a problem with sorting out the format of the debate. So it seems to me very unlikely that it will happen. What she wanted was an easy PR win to say Corbyn wouldn't do it. She hasn't got it.
Look, if the problem is scheduling, I right now will offer this platform, Tisky Sour, the day before the vote, 8 p.m, Novara Media, Theresa May versus Jeremy Corbyn.
Can I advocate my new policy, which
I
did
on.
mention on Twitter, which is that all public debates should be replaced by pub car park fights? I would love that.
That's an easy way to sort out Brexit.
I'm not sure I'd want to watch Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May in a pub car park fight. I don't think that's... I just don't like it.
Sure?
Yeah. Back to activism. Another Europe is Possible have announced they'll be hosting a rally to oppose both Brexit and the latest Tommy Robinson rally. This has riled up some on the left. How's it riled up you, Dawn?
What's the point? I mean, surely people who are Leave and Remain both oppose Tommy Robinson. It seems so bizarre to try and tie two things together. It just makes no sense to me, as a lot of this kind of vein of campaigning does. The anti-fascist movement, the anti-Tommy Robinson movement should just be about that. Why try and tie it together? Why try and alienate so many people who would otherwise be on your side?
I think one thing that's happened with Another Europe is Possible is they've said over and over again, look, sorry, we didn't mean for the People's Vote movement to be dominated by Alistair Campbell et al. Reasonably.
Yeah.
And then they said, what we want to be a traditional leftist movement. But then the left have sort of said, like, no. So it's this kind of idea that they think by doing traditional leftist things, people will suddenly start to back the campaign.
Look,
but it is pretty unhelpful. I mean,
it's just dangerous.
There's nothing that anti-fascism could do that would be less helpful than tying its message to Remain, because what's that suggesting is that it's the 48% against the 52%.
This is the whole that slogan, which ties things together in that way, is accepting Tommy Robinson's framing. Tommy Robinson is essentially saying, don't allow the Brexit betrayal. I am the hero of Brexit.
Yeah.
To say then that you're there to oppose Tommy Robinson as the hero of Brexit is to say, he's right. He is the hero of Brexit, and we're against them. Now, I don't think, and I don't think anyone else thinks that everyone who voted to leave the EU thinks Tommy Robinson is great. That's clearly not the case. So let's not say it. There's a point made, I think, very strongly by an article that went out on our website today, which made an argument for separating out this kind of anti-fascism from something like Another Europe is Possible, or separating out from wider politics. I go back and forth on that. I think in this case it's true, but I think also connecting anti-fascism to like a wider tradition of left-wing politics, and I think there's been some really, really strong work done by feminist activists and people who concentrate on stuff like social reproduction and stuff like that, about like making the anti-fascist movement part of their politics and learning from each other in that way. So I think that's, I wouldn't say that there's like just an anti-fascist politics that should be dissevered from something wider. But in this case, like it's a matter of buying into what Tommy Robinson is painting the picture as, and I think that's a bad strategy.
It's interesting. There's what's going on at the moment is the new leader of UKIP, so Gerard Batten, has employed Tommy Robinson to be their advisor on rape gangs, and Nigel Farage has said he's going to try and come back and block this. So, I mean, within the far right itself, UKIP are trying to pretend they're not far right, and Gerard Batten's... there's two strategies within UKIP, right, to try and save their electoral chances. One is to go for the true Brexit party. So they say the Tories have betrayed Brexit voters, and we are the party for a proper Brexit. So if May gets through some sort of fudge deal, then maybe among Eurosceptic voters, they'll get a boost. The other, which Gerard Batten seems to have sort of pitched to, is becoming a sort of European-style anti-Muslim far-right party where all they do is try and stoke hate against Muslims, basically. And they've employed Tommy Robinson to do this, which is clearly suggesting that they're going down one particular direction. Does that make Nigel Farage... Are we backing Nigel Farage in this one?
No, of course not. Because, I think basically Farage's main concern, as has been the case always, is Farage. And so he worries that at the moment, after Brexit, which was what he wanted, he was completely sidelined. He thought he could get in with Donald Trump, and that didn't work. And Trump has said tonight that with the current Brexit deal, Theresa May and Britain wouldn't be able to trade with the US. So Farage is worried about his legacy, as all kind of tedious politicians are. And at the moment, it's very, very clear that UKIP's legacy will just fall into the doldrums. So, I think even if there is a Brexit that some Leave voters who voted UKIP wouldn't want, it's still in the minority. I think the majority of people don't know what kind of Brexit they voted for. A lot of people aren't hardcore Remainers who are jumping around on trampolines and setting fire to things outside the European Union. And I just think that the vast majority of people have a relative amount of ambivalence about the direction that this takes. They either want to remain or they want to leave, but when, in terms of the exact state that it is, I think that there is a lot of ambivalence. So I think that UKIP are kind of grappling with the relevancy, but so is Farage.
Lee Davenport has correctly pointed out his name is Stephen Yaxley-Lennon and not Tommy Robinson.
Does it matter?
Well, I think there's I think it makes sense to say don't buy into the image, and anything you can use to suggest that he's a fraud instead of sort of like a genuine...
It feels like a kind of distraction, as if the only reason we buy into it is because of what he's currently called himself. And I think that if we look closer at his trajectory, so especially his movement from the EDL through Quilliam, who used a lot of money to try and launder him and then made him much worse, is a lot more... It's a much better use of our time than saying, he changed his name.
Yeah, the answer here, of course, is the classic Stalin phrase: "Both are worse."
Yeah,
that's what I think of when I think of Robinson and Farage. I think in Farage's case, as you say, he's protecting a legacy, and there is the expectation, I think, on the part of the leaders of UKIP, say Batten now, that any Brexit delivered by the Tory government will mean a renaissance in the polls for UKIP at any future general election. And one of the things to say is that there is a very interesting piece by Vernon Bogdanor, who's a professor of politics and governance at King's now, I think. He taught David Cameron when he was at Oxford. Thanks, Vernon. But he was saying, effectively, if May is unable to get her deal passed, or if any subsequent amendment to the deal is passed, her authority is effectively shattered. There will be a resignation. She will have to resign. Now,
well, after the first time?
No, after the second time.
Okay, sorry.
Conceivably after the first time.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. And in that case, I think there's a very clear line of argument for a general election. But what's striking to me here is that he said, that his line of argument was that she would go to the EU and say, look, we need to renegotiate this. And the EU will say, we only negotiate with people who have democratic legitimacy. And you can't command a majority in the House of Commons on so fundamental an issue for your nation. You have no democratic legitimacy.
Did the EU ever care about democratic legitimacy?
No, only when it suits them. Only when it suits them.
And it might suit them now.
And it will suit them now. I mean, Macron has already thrown a bomb in about fisheries. Again, very boring Brexit policy stuff. But I suppose the other thing, just to make clear about the EU, is that I think people are very enthusiastic about the European Union at the moment. So like the FBP crew, but also like people who are sympathetic to them, if not quite so headbanging on social media, are now seeing all of their kind of most admired European leaders turn around and say, this deal is the only one available, it's got to pass through the House of Commons. This is a point at which we should not abandon our basic political scepticism. It's politics. This is, of course, what they're going to say. It is, of course, necessary for them to say it to get it passed. And we should realise that they will extend Article 50 if they feel they have to. And it's certainly possible that they'll reopen negotiations if a substantial change in British politics takes place.
I'm going to start taking some of your questions. So as you're typing them, as ever, we want to get more people watching these videos. We want to grow as an organisation. So please like this video. Please share it on all your social media channels. And please, obviously, this organisation relies on your financial support. So if you have the means, please subscribe to Novara Media at support.novaramedia.com. As you know, we are asking for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month so we can keep working around the clock.
Ask us some questions.
Oh, this is Jane Pickering. Could you talk about the possibility of civil unrest? So people like Stephen Bush are talking increasingly about how even though there's no majority for no deal in Parliament, it could be the only likely constitutional outcome because there's no majority for anything. So if no deal happens, do you see civil unrest happening on Britain's streets?
Yes. I think that's quite likely in the scenario. I mean, we should be clear about what we're talking about when we talk about no deal, right? Because it seems to me like pretty clear that even in the worst of all possible scenarios, there'll be like a skeleton agreement rapidly passed to allow clearing, to allow aviation to take place. You'll still get like the lorries and all of that kind of stuff at the ports and whatever. That will all happen. The very, very basics and very fundamentals seem to me like that's not going to be, So the scare story now is that we won't have drinking water within 3 days. I don't think that's very likely.
Oh, come on, we're going to have drinking water. Who's saying that?
So it's the chemicals that are used to purify drinking water in reservoirs and stuff like that can't be stockpiled because they are extremely volatile. So they're in just-in-time shipment trains.
And who makes it?
It's made on the continent. It's imported, largely imported here. It could be made domestically. So it wouldn't be surprising if it were made domestically. Anyway, so stuff like that I think is a bit dangerous because it suggests that the worst of all possible scenarios. You can get that skeleton agreement in place and still have like very, very deep civil unrest. And the places it will come from are not necessarily easily predictable. I don't think it's likely that there will be a sort of people's march from West London to storm Parliament to demand continued membership of the European Union. I think that's probably quite unlikely. I do think that we face, regardless of the possibilities, regardless of the outcome, in fact, I think civil unrest from the far right is likely. I don't think, as many people on the left sometimes argue, that the possibility of civil unrest from the far right should necessarily constrain our options, but we should be prepared for it, and we should understand where it comes from. We should understand how to neutralise it, not just in the streets, but politically and rhetorically and in media and in argument and in our communities as well. I think that's really, really important. Because, look, I saw this, a friend who is in Oxford, sent me a photo, swastika graffiti on the wall near her house, and you think, this stuff is becoming more prevalent, and we should understand that, that civil unrest arises from social division. We've had a very divisive political period in this country, and that's not just because of Brexit, by the way, and it seems to me only likely to continue.
The other area there'll be a lot of civil unrest if there is a no-deal Brexit, and there's actually been academic research into this, will be the Northern Irish border. Because if there is a hard border, there will be a lot of unrest around that. And
Would there be? So what would that look like?
so, according to the research from Queen's University Belfast, the majority of people said that they would be happy to tear down any form of infrastructure that was, linked to the border. But a lot of people I speak to talk about the fact that whenever this is brought up, people focus on nationalist and unionist paramilitaries, disgruntled people who aren't entirely happy that the Troubles has ended. But actually the bigger worry at the moment is gangs from Eastern Europe who come in and do a lot of smuggling via the border. And if there is a hard border, then actually those people will be a lot more disgruntled. So if there is a hard border, there is so much smuggling over the border at the moment anyway. And you add that into the mix and it all gets a lot more complex.
So I'm going to go back to basics, but what gets smuggled across the Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland border?
A lot of drugs, a lot of petrol, because petrol's cheaper. A lot of
Where's
things.
petrol cheaper? In the north or in the south?
I think it's cheaper in the north.
Sorry, that's putting you on the spot a little bit.
I don't drive. I don't drive, but I know it's one or the other.
Differences between the two countries.
So between...
But drugs are illegal in both places, but I suppose you've got to move.
Exactly.
You've got to move drugs somewhere, haven't you?
I was speaking to some businessmen and they basically said that, if there was a hard border in place, you could make a lot more smuggling garlic than you could smuggling drugs. And who is going to arrest you for smuggling garlic? And, and there have already been some prosecutions recently. I was arrested in Dublin for a kind of a killing in the north that was linked to kind of gang movements between the north and the south. So, a hard border will cause a lot of unrest already, both politically, but also because of existing things that are going on between the north and the south.
So I was just blown away by this question. I don't know if you've... I feel like you might have an answer to this, James. Daniel Eden, was Trotsky right when he said a United States of Europe was a necessary step towards European socialism? Can there be a national road to socialism?
It's very funny, actually, this question. So, no, I actually personally don't think there can be a national road to socialism, although I find lots very, very interesting about the Italian experience here, which I won't go into. If you come to the Novara party, I promise I will bore you, if you want, about the experiences of the PECI, the Italian Communist Party, and how it relates to that. But no, I don't think
tickets are £7. That's an offer you can't refuse.
I don't think there is necessarily a national road to socialism. I think Nye Bevan made a very interesting point in 1957 when he made and this was talking about the common market, as was saying, how can socialists hope to run a planned economy across the world when they, without taking power within the small part of it that they're already responsible, they're already vying for control for. So I think that question of the national and the international is a very vexed one and quite a difficult one. I do think a United States of Europe is probably somewhere a social federation, a socialist federation is likely the future for Europe, hopefully the future for Europe. I just want to recommend here a really, really strong piece by Leah Upi, who teaches political theory at the LSE. It's on the LSE blog, and it's basically her rejection of either the sort of pro-EU or kind of isolationist socialism, and arguing that actually the nature of international order and the nature of contemporary politics requires a concept of socialism which is focused on transforming the international order. Really, really sharp, really stimulating piece.
Don Foster, I want clairvoyance.
I have no clairvoyance for you. Go on.
May loses second vote in Commons. What happens next? Predictions. This is from Eduardo Piras. No, loses a second vote in Commons, sorry. Oh, you think a general election?
I think she has to go for a general election. I think exactly what James says, that even if we can't push her and say you don't have a democratic mandate, I think, the DUP will not back her. They're not going to back her. But I think she goes back to Europe and Europe say you don't have a democratic mandate, you have to go for a general election. And I think that's what we have to be aiming for. Not a people's vote with people bouncing on fucking trampolines. We have to go for a general election.
I should just point out, there's another comment there that Lenin said in that if we were to achieve sort of socialism in the United States of Europe, would necessarily be reactionary under actually existing capitalism, until we achieve socialism, the United States of Europe would be necessarily reactionary. That is, of course, true.
Until we get socialism.
Yeah.
But then, so we get the socialism within the nation states, and then we decide to make a confederation of socialist European nation
That
states.
is certainly a possible way. I mean, look, the other.
I mean, all the routes are hard, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, this is also kind of a bit angels on pinheads at this point. But like, I mean, one of the things I think that is really, really striking here is the way in which various parts of the left thought about and argued about the formation of the European Union. So obviously you have within the New Left Review, you have Tom Nairn's issue length essay on Europe, really, really striking and subtle and intelligent. You have debates within the Labour Party who are confronted with this thing, where they worry, and again Bevan is important here, where he worries about outsourcing the duty of socialists domestically to this sort of paranational organisation, and that remains to me a kind of strikingly important critique of the European Union. Then you have someone like Isaac Deutscher, who's like a really important left historian, Trotskyist, intelligent Trotskyist, not always. Those two things don't always go together. Like really, really smart though, really, really worth reading. And he writes about hoping that within moves towards the common market and the European community, like a kind of warped prefiguring of what a socialist future might look like. And I think that again is really striking to pick up on what might be positive in an otherwise rather awful entity.
Final question, I think. This is from Gatto Nero 616. Do you know the origin of this name? Is there some sort of story to go with it?
Well, Gatto Nero is Black Cat, and 616 is 161, surely.
No, 616.
Okay, 616. Well, 616 is what was supposed to have been the original number of the beast. So there are manuscripts of Revelations which have 616 rather than 666. Anyway, so
Carry on.
Well, Gatto Nero 616, you can tell us if James Butler was correct there. That's one of my favourite things about getting him on the show. He understands all the nuances of your bizarre names. I don't know if it looked bizarre to me, obviously I don't understand the meaning. Anyway, the question is, in a general election scenario, what will be your grammar's not very good. In a general election scenario, what will be Labour's European proposal? And I'm going to add to that a question which is basically the same, well, that sort of expands on it, from Pat H. He says, give 3 things from May's current deal that Labour can pick up and improve upon, and how and why the EU would agree to it. So we're looking at what would Labour's programmatic European policy be were there to be a general election. I'm putting you both on the spot. Who wants to go first?
I mean, I can. So the first thing is to say, Labour obviously in a bind about this. They've been very comfortable on the 6 tests. It's been very good for the Labour Party to be able to be critical rather than propositional. I thought actually early on this would screw the Labour Party. I was wrong about that. So the what would I want Labour's position, or what do I think it should be?
Let's do
what
both.
could it pick up on? So I mean, I'd like to see them pick up on alignment in the environment, and say again, our basic regulatory stance will be that we will match on environment and workers' rights the EU positions on that, and we'll use them as a floor, not a ceiling, so we can go above them, but we won't undercut you on workers' rights and the environment. And we want to be released from alignment with your state aid positions. So we will guarantee that we won't do X, Y, or Z in terms of what you worry most about in terms of state aid, but ultimately we want your guarantee that you won't use as, and again, this is one of the things, so CJEU jurisprudence here is weird. It seems to emphasise one article over the other, but there is room for manoeuvre, I think, within the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union to say, look, you need to give us more wiggle room on state aid, and that's important.
I just went through an emotional roller coaster. I'm going to have to interrupt. You'll get to answer the question, obviously, but I thought we had found a gap in James's knowledge. So Daryl Malone said 616 is the Marvel Comics original universe. I was like, oh, they found something James doesn't know about. But then The actual Gato Nero 616 came in and he said he was right. 616 is the original number of the beast.
Yeah.
So you got it.
I'm annoyed because James said exactly what I was going to say, and I
So
can't
we're
think of anything
linked
else.
telepathically.
Because state aid is a problem,
yeah,
but I'm perfectly fine with like workers' rights and environmental rights as the floor. We have to go above it. We can't go below it, and so I'm really annoyed that James just stole my.
I mean, I guess
Also, just give Northern Ireland back after a referendum.
I mean, I guess the other question is about freedom of movement, right? And I said earlier in the show, obviously, that I don't think Labour is bound by the, headbangers that they have in the Conservative Party. But it's unquestionable to me that there is a portion of the Labour base who want freedom of movement ended, who don't like it, who feel their consent was never sought for it in the first place, and who would be iffy about it. But one of the things that I think was very, very striking is that in the polling Survation did about Brexit, when they asked, which of these things would you be happy with in a Brexit deal, and I think it was 60-something, and I forget the second digit. I think it was about 64%. People said they would be
disappointing, James. 60-something. That's a very vague
well,
figure.
I'm at the bottom of my second can of Tisky at this point. So, so anyway, that they would be more or less comfortable with people kind of being able to move freely and live and work here. So people are able to look. It is an issue for many people, but the salience of the issue is the question.
Salience is key. We are going to end the show there. Thank you both for coming on.
You're welcome.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Claire and Claire, for coming on earlier. We will be back the same time, same place next week. Well, I'm not going to tell you what we're going to be discussing. We'll tell you on Twitter, probably on the day or the day before. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like the show, to share the show, and to support.novaramedia.com. I'm Michael Walker. This was Tisky Sour. We are Novara Media. Goodbye.